6 people were murdered on a remote Bavarian farm in March 1922. The killer was never caught, but that is not the most disturbing part of this story. The most disturbing part is what the evidence showed about how long the killer had been there before anyone died, and how long they stayed after. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck. It sat in a forest clearing roughly 40 miles north of Munich in the German state of Bavaria, a remote working farm, isolated, surrounded by trees on all sides. The nearest neighbors far enough away that sounds from the farm would not carry. 6 people lived there. Andreas Gruber, the farmer, was 63 years old. His wife Kazelia was 72. Their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel was 35. Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Kazelia and 2-year-old Joseph, and the family's maid. In late March 1922, all 6 of them were found dead. 4 of them in the barn, 2 in the farmhouse, killed with a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a pointed end used for breaking up hard soil, a tool that came from the farm itself. The investigation that followed lasted for years. Multiple suspects were identified and eliminated. The files were passed between investigators multiple times over multiple decades. The case was reopened repeatedly as new forensic techniques became available. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever definitively identified as responsible, and the specific details of what investigators found at Hinterkaifeck in those first hours after the bodies were discovered are the reason this case has stayed in the minds of everyone who has ever studied it. To understand what made Hinterkaifeck different from an ordinary rural murder, you need to understand the sequence of events in the weeks before the bodies were found. Weeks, not hours, weeks. Approximately 6 months before the murders, the previous maid who had worked at the farm abruptly quit. She refused to give a detailed explanation. She told people who asked that she had left because the farm felt wrong, that there were noises she could not explain, that she believed the farm was haunted and she would not stay there. This detail was noted and then largely dismissed by investigators at the time. Superstitious rural workers leaving employment over ghost stories was not considered remarkable in Bavaria in 1921. But then consider what Andreas Gruber himself reported to neighbors in the weeks immediately before the murders. Gruber told multiple people that he had found footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest to the farm. Fresh footprints, made by someone walking toward the farm, but no footprints leading away. Whoever had walked to the farm from the forest had not walked back into the forest. Gruber also reported that a newspaper had appeared at the farm that nobody in the household had purchased or ordered, that keys to the farm had gone missing, that he had heard footsteps in the attic above the family's sleeping quarters on multiple nights. He reported all of this to his neighbors. He did not report it to police. This was 1922 rural Bavaria. A farmer's instinct was to handle problems on his own property himself, and Gruber was by all accounts a stubborn and private man. Whatever was happening at Hinterkaifeck, Gruber had decided he could manage it. He was wrong. On or around the evening of March 31st, 1922, someone lured the adults of the family to the barn one by one. Andreas, his wife Kazelia, his daughter Victoria, and young Kazelia, 7 years old. Each of them was killed in the barn with the mattock. The farmhouse was then entered. 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his crib. The maid was killed in her bed. The killer then, based on the evidence investigators found, remained at the farm for days. The neighbors noticed that nobody from the farm had been seen for several days. The children had not appeared at school. Smoke had been seen rising from the chimney, meaning fires were being lit inside the farmhouse. Someone had fed the farm animals. The mail had been collected from the mailbox. Someone was living at Hinterkaifeck after the murders. Someone who could maintain the appearance of normal farm activity well enough that no neighbor felt the immediate need to investigate. When neighbors finally went to the farm on April 4th, 1922, 4 days after the estimated time of death, they found the bodies, the barn, 4 members of the family lying where they had fallen, the farmhouse, the maid in her bed, the toddler in his crib, and evidence throughout the farm that someone had been eating the family's food, sleeping in the family's beds, and maintaining enough of a routine to keep the farm animals alive and the fires burning for 4 days after killing everyone who lived there. Investigators who processed the scene noted several things that elevated this case beyond an ordinary rural homicide. The first was the footprints, or rather the absence of them. Fresh snow had fallen around the time of the murders. Investigators found footprints leading to the farm from the direction of a nearby road. They did not find footprints leading away from the farm in any direction. This suggested one of 2 things. Either the killer had arrived before the snow fell and left after it had been disturbed enough to obscure their tracks, or the killer had not left at all by the time investigators arrived. The second was the weapon. The mattock used in the killings belonged to the farm. This suggested either that the killer had come without a weapon and improvised with what was available, or that the killer was familiar enough with the farm to know where the tools were kept and confident enough to use them. The third was the targeting sequence. The fact that the barn victims and the farmhouse victims were killed separately suggested a killer who was calm, organized, and in control throughout the attack. This was not a frenzied assault, it was a systematic elimination of everyone present. The fourth was the 4 days of occupation afterward. Investigators could not explain this. A killer who remains at a murder scene for 4 days is not behaving like someone driven by panic or impulse. They are behaving like someone who is either waiting for something, hiding from something, or so comfortable in that space that leaving it did not feel urgent. None of the explanations that fit ordinary criminal psychology fit the Hinterkaifeck evidence. The investigation produced a list of suspects that included neighbors, a former prisoner of war who had worked at the farm, and a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer who had a complicated personal history with Victoria Gabriel. Schlittenbauer had been one of the people who discovered the bodies. He had also at various points claimed to be the father of Victoria's youngest child, Joseph. His behavior at the crime scene was noted by other witnesses as unusual. He had moved some of the bodies before investigators arrived, an action he claimed was motivated by distress, but which made forensic analysis of the scene significantly more difficult. Schlittenbauer was investigated extensively. He denied involvement consistently. He was never charged. He died in 1941, and the evidence against him, while circumstantially suggestive, was never sufficient to establish a case. Other suspects were investigated and eliminated. The files were eventually sent to Munich, where they remained in the police archives. In the 1980s, students at a police academy were assigned the Hinterkaifeck case as an exercise in cold case methodology. They reviewed the entire investigative record using modern analytical frameworks. They identified several persons of interest that the original investigators had not fully pursued. Their work produced new theories. It did not produce an answer. The farm itself was demolished in 1923, the year after the murders. Completely demolished. The foundations were dug up and removed. The wood was burned. The site was cleared so thoroughly that today there is no physical evidence that the farm ever stood there. A small memorial marks the location. Nothing else remains. The reason for the demolition was practical. Nobody would buy the property. Nobody would work it. The farm had become something that rural Bavarian communities in 1923 did not know how to process, and so chose to simply erase. But erasing the farm did not erase the questions. Here is what the evidence established with reasonable certainty. Someone was present at Hinterkaifeck for an extended period before the murders. Someone who moved through the farm without being detected by 6 people living there. Someone who knew the property well enough to navigate it in the dark. Someone who left footprints in the snow approaching the farm and left no footprints leaving it. Someone killed 6 people, including a 7-year-old child and a 2-year-old toddler, with a farming implement in a sequence that suggested complete control and zero panic. And then someone lived in the farmhouse of the people they had just killed for approximately 4 days, eating their food, tending their animals, collecting their mail, before walking away into an investigation that lasted decades, that produced no answer, and closed with the demolition of the only physical space where the answer might have been found. Here is what the evidence did not establish: who, why, how they arrived, and how they left without leaving tracks in the snow, what they were waiting for during those 4 days, whether anyone else knew what had happened at Hinterkaifeck before the neighbors found the bodies, and what happened to the missing farm keys, the keys that Andreas Gruber had reported missing weeks before the murders, the keys that would have allowed someone to move freely in and out of a locked farmhouse without breaking anything and without leaving evidence of forced entry, the keys that were never found. 6 people died in a forest clearing in Bavaria in 1922. A child of 7, a toddler of 2, a 72-year-old woman, a farmer who thought he could handle whatever was making noises in his attic, and for over 100 years, the person who killed them has remained exactly where they went after leaving that farm, completely invisible. If the cases that nobody ever fully closed are the ones you came here for, subscribe, because the next one is already waiting, and the files are already open. We just need to go through them together.